Chapter 1. The Unlikely Encounter. The mountains were always where I felt the most alive, the most at peace. My small cabin sat on the edge of a steep cliff, surrounded by dense woods and jagged peaks that rose higher than any man-made structure could ever hope to match. The days were long and slow, with nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird or animal to remind me that I wasn't alone in the world. But tonight was different. It was the kind of night that felt strange from the moment the sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving the world bathed in shadow and cold. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like some forgotten spirit desperate to be heard. The storm had arrived suddenly, almost as if it had been waiting for the perfect moment to descend upon me. It was the kind of storm that rattled the very bones of the earth, the kind of night where even the most grounded souls would feel the stirrings of something otherworldly. I had always lived alone. There was something freeing about being so isolated, about being far away from the noise and demands of society. My cabin was a place of refuge, a sanctuary where I could escape into the wilds of nature and forget about everything else. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I thrived in it. People often said that solitude was a curse, that it could twist a person's mind, but I never felt that way. It was just me and the mountains, and that was enough for me. But as the storm raged outside, something else stirred within me, a feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the storm, though that was enough to make anyone feel uneasy. There was something deeper, something primal, stirring within the air. Something was calling me. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was the thunder, but the moment the first flash of lightning lit up the sky, I felt it in my gut, a pull, an undeniable force that urged me to move. I hesitated at first, unsure of what to make of the sensation, but curiosity won over. The storm was relentless, and with each gust of wind, the trees outside my cabin bent and groaned under its weight. I grabbed my jacket, pulled on my boots, and stepped out into the tempest. The wind slapped my face, stinging my skin with its icy touch, but I pressed on. There was something in the air, something that made me feel as though I was walking a fine line between this world and the next, between the known and the unknown. The storm had obscured everything. Even the trees, which normally seemed like old friends, felt foreign tonight. As I walked farther from the cabin, I could hear nothing but the wild screams of the wind and the occasional crack of thunder. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long I wandered through the woods, driven by an instinct I couldn't quite explain. My senses were heightened, every step I took feeling like it brought me closer to something important, something life-changing. And then, as though the storm itself had decided to reveal its secret, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, a shadow or flicker of light that had no real substance. But then I saw it again, another flash of light, a glimmer in the distance, and it wasn't the storm this time. It was something else, something not of this world. My heart began to race as I took a cautious step forward, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There, nestled between two massive trees, stood a ship. Not a plane, not a helicopter, but a ship that could have only come from the stars. It shimmered in the rain, its sleek metallic surface reflecting the flashes of lightning as though it were alive. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before, not in any movie or book or story. Its shape was smooth, organic, almost fluid, as if it had been grown rather than constructed. The hull seemed to ripple in the storm's light, shifting in a way that made it seem almost like liquid metal. My mind couldn't comprehend it at first, couldn't reconcile the image of a spacecraft in the middle of a storm in the woods. But there it was, undeniable, magnificent, and terrifying all at once. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, frozen for a moment, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. I had no idea how long I stood there, caught between awe and fear. The storm continued to rage around me, but it felt like the world had slowed down, as though time itself had decided to take a breath and wait. My heart pounded in my chest, and yet, there was an overwhelming sense of urgency that gnawed at me, urging me to get closer, to understand, to know. With each step I took toward the ship, the feeling in my gut grew stronger, like I was being pulled by some invisible force. I couldn't explain it, but I had to go closer. As I drew near, the ship began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate deep in my chest. It wasn't the hum of an engine, but something far more subtle, more primal, as though the ship itself was alive, reacting to my presence. I stepped closer still, and that was when I saw her. She was crouched beneath the shadow of the ship, hidden from view at first, but I could see her now, her form barely visible in the dim light. She was small, fragile, her body hunched as though trying to make herself as small as possible. Her skin was a pale, almost translucent shade of blue, her hair long and flowing like silver threads caught in the wind. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed with an intensity that matched the storm's fury, flickering like twin emerald flames. She looked terrified, and as our gazes met, I felt a shock ripple through me, a connection, a bond, something inexplicable. Her eyes seemed to be pleading with me, but at the same time, she seemed too scared to approach me. Her body trembled in the rain, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness, a need to shield her from whatever was threatening her. Before I could make a move, she spoke, her voice faint, barely audible over the howling wind. "Please, don't hurt me." The words seemed almost too fragile to be real, but there they were, full of raw fear and desperation. I could see that she was trying to say something more, but the storm and the terror she was feeling seemed to make it difficult for her to communicate. I took a step forward, instinctively moving toward her, wanting to comfort her, to assure her that she was safe here, but she shrank back, her body curling in on itself, her wide eyes flicking between me and the dark, looming ship. The tension in the air thickened, and I realized just how much she had been through. Something had driven her to this point, something horrible, something unimaginable. I couldn't leave her there, alone in the storm. As much as my mind screamed for caution, something deep inside me told me that helping her was the right thing to do. "I won't hurt you," I said gently, taking another step closer, slowly, carefully, trying not to startle her. Her gaze shifted toward me, still filled with fear, but there was a flicker of hope there as well. Without another word, I extended my hand toward her, and after a long, tense moment, she slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took it. The touch was electric warm, yet cool at the same time. A strange, tingling sensation shot through my fingertips as her hand clasped mine, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to this than just a chance encounter in the woods. Something deeper, something that neither of us yet understood. Her touch lingered, though the moment felt like 1,000 years, the rain now falling harder around us, almost as if the very skies were urging me to make a decision. I could see the tremble in her delicate hand, the way her body quivered beneath the strain of her emotions. I took another step closer, wrapping my fingers gently around hers, giving her a sense of stability, an unspoken promise that I would protect her from whatever had led her here. But the look in her eyes still held uncertainty, fear, and something else I couldn't quite place, something almost otherworldly. As I drew her slowly from beneath the shadow of the ship, she made no protest, and the fragile woman stood before me, completely drenched, but still holding herself together in some way I couldn't comprehend. She looked at me, her wide eyes searching my face as if trying to understand if I was friend or foe, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to regain some semblance of composure. But I knew she was broken, and whatever had happened before her arrival had left its mark on her in ways that I could only imagine. "What's your name?" I asked gently, almost instinctively. My voice was low, a whisper that barely reached her ears over the roar of the wind, but she heard me. There was a pause, long enough that I began to wonder if she would even answer me. And then she did, but not with words. She spoke with her eyes, her mouth trembling, her lips parting as if to say something, but no sound came out. It was as if the very concept of speaking was foreign to her in that moment. Her gaze shifted, looking at the ship behind her, then back to me. Her expression was a mixture of caution and longing, like she had seen too much, experienced things no one should ever have to. There was a strange sadness in the way she held herself, and I couldn't help but feel a deep pit of guilt for not understanding it fully. But in that moment, something told me that her pain wasn't something that could be simply fixed or understood. It had been woven into her very existence. I crouched down before her, trying to lessen the distance between us, my face level with hers. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The words were clumsy and inadequate in the face of everything she had endured, but they were all I could offer. She hesitated, her eyes scanning my face before finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The rain continued to pour down, but I wasn't focused on that anymore. In that instant, it was just the two of us, no storm, no lightning, No raging winds, just me and this mysterious, fragile creature that I had found in the middle of nowhere, in the most unlikely of circumstances. As I helped her stand, I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen in the chaos of our first encounter. Her clothes, if you could call them that, seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow, shifting with every movement she made. It wasn't fabric in the way I understood it, but something far more alien, something that seemed almost organic. It clung to her body in strange, liquid-like patterns, as if woven from starlight itself. My eyes lingered, unable to avoid the strange beauty of her, the uniqueness that set her apart from everything I had known. But there was also a palpable fear in her posture, an anxiety that could only be rooted in the depths of some unimaginable horror she had lived through. Without thinking, I gently placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the shelter of my cabin, where warmth and safety awaited. She didn't resist, though her every step was cautious, unsure, as though the ground beneath her was unstable. We moved slowly, carefully, with the storm battering us from all sides, but I couldn't help but feel that this was no ordinary meeting. The way our paths had crossed, so inexplicably, and the strange pull I had felt toward her, there was a deeper connection here, something I couldn't explain. She wasn't just lost or stranded. She was something more, and I was beginning to suspect that the storm wasn't the only thing that had brought her here. We reached the cabin, and I gently opened the door, ushering her inside where the warmth of the fire and the smell of dry wood filled the air. She paused at the threshold, hesitant, and I could see the wariness in her movements. I could tell she was still processing, still unsure of her surroundings and the person who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere to offer her refuge. I closed the door behind us, leaving the storm outside, and as I did, she finally spoke, her voice still a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Thank you." Her words were shaky, fragile, as if the simple act of speaking had been something she hadn't done in a long time. But her gratitude was there, palpable in the air between us. I offered her a seat near the fire, where she could dry off and rest. She sat down hesitantly, glancing around the small cabin, her gaze settling on the various objects scattered around: books, tools, weathered maps on the walls. It was clear that she was trying to make sense of this new environment, to understand where she was and who I was. But there was still that fear in her eyes, that guarded expression that seemed to be permanently etched into her features. "I don't know where I am, or what's happening," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly, as if the weight of her words was almost too much to bear. I'm not from here." There was a deep sorrow in her voice, a sadness that transcended words. It was as though she was carrying the weight of an entire galaxy on her shoulders, a burden I couldn't fathom. But even in her vulnerability, there was something else, something strong, something that refused to let her break, no matter how much the world had tried to shatter her. Chapter 2. Unspoken Bonds. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the cabin besides the faint patter of rain against the windows. The storm had yet to subside, but inside, a strange stillness had settled between us. I kept my distance, though I could feel the weight of her gaze on me as she sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to warm herself. I had offered her some dry clothes, and though she hesitated, she accepted them, her fingers brushing against mine for a brief moment as I handed them over. I could feel the electricity between us, subtle but undeniable. But as she changed, I turned away, giving her the space she needed to regain her composure. The last thing I wanted was to make her feel more uncomfortable than she already was. When she emerged from the makeshift dressing area, I noticed a change in her. The tension in her posture had loosened slightly, though she still moved with caution, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail as if she were preparing for something. I knew she was trying to make sense of everything, trying to understand how she had ended up in my world, in my cabin, in my life. And I had to admit, I was just as confused. How could I have stumbled across this alien, this beautiful, terrified woman, who had somehow found her way into my life without explanation? Her eyes were still wide with uncertainty, but there was something else there now, a hint of curiosity, a flicker of trust, a silent question that seemed to hang in the air between us. "What do you need?" I asked quietly, unsure of what I could offer her beyond shelter and warmth. But I knew, even as the words left my lips, that what she truly needed wasn't something I could easily provide. It wasn't food, it wasn't shelter, and it certainly wasn't any sort of material possession. What she needed What she truly needed was someone to help her make sense of everything that had brought her to this point. She needed someone to show her that she wasn't alone, that there was still hope, even in the face of something as alien as herself. "I don't know what I need," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where to go, or what to do." She paused, her eyes flickering to the fire, the flames dancing in her gaze as though they were some sort of reflection of her inner turmoil. "I've lost so much. I don't know if I can go on." I could hear the pain in her words, a kind of anguish that resonated deep in my soul. She wasn't just lost in the literal sense. She was lost in every sense of the word. And yet, as I looked at her, I could see something else, something stronger than the pain, something more resilient than any force that had tried to break her. She had endured unimaginable hardship, but she had survived. That, I realized, was something extraordinary. There was a silence between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts, until she spoke again, this time her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not from here." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, I didn't know how to respond. How could I? How could I possibly understand what she was saying? But somehow, I knew that whatever she was running from, whatever had brought her here, was far beyond anything I had ever known. Her words echoed in the stillness of the cabin, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world paused, waiting for some revelation to break through the tension. "I'm not from here," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly, as though saying it out loud might make the reality of it all feel even more surreal. I wasn't sure how to respond. How could anyone respond to such a statement? She wasn't from here. She wasn't from Earth, I realized. The gravity of her words sank in, heavier than the storm that still raged outside, and the weight of the unknown began to feel oppressive. I studied her as she sat by the fire, her face bathed in the flickering orange light. Her long hair, still wet from the rain, shimmered in the glow, and despite the clear signs of fear and exhaustion in her posture, there was a strange beauty in the way she held herself, fragile, yet unyielding. She was different, so incredibly different from anything I had ever known. But beneath the alien exterior, I could see the same vulnerability that any person, regardless of where they came from, might feel in a moment of crisis. Her eyes, though bright and filled with otherworldly color, held a deep sadness that spoke of loss and survival in ways that words couldn't capture. "Where are you from?" I asked quietly, my voice gentle, more to myself than to her. But she heard me, and after a long pause, she looked up at me, her gaze sharp, intense, almost piercing. For a long moment, she didn't speak, just watched me as if deciding how much to reveal, how much of herself to share. I could feel the weight of her silence, but I didn't push her. Instead, I waited, knowing that in her own time, she would share what she was willing. "I came from a place far beyond the stars," she said at last, her voice a soft whisper, her eyes distant as though she were reliving memories that hurt too much to recount. "A world, a system. It's gone now." She swallowed hard, the words clearly difficult for her to say. The pain in her eyes was impossible to ignore. I could see that she had been through something catastrophic, something unimaginable. It was destroyed. Her voice faltered, and she closed her eyes briefly as though trying to shut out the images that rushed to her mind. "I don't know how I got here, or why I ended up in your world." She looked at me then, her gaze piercing through me as though she could read my thoughts. "But I am here now, and I don't know if I'll survive much longer without some kind of help." I didn't know how to react. This wasn't a problem I could easily solve. She had come from the stars, her home was gone, and now she was stranded in a place she didn't understand, with no idea of what was waiting for her here. I had no answers, nothing that could make her feel any more secure. But one thing I did know for certain was that she wasn't going to be alone. Not while I was here. I didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fix everything she had endured, but I could give her safety. I could give her the time to rest, to heal. Without a word, I moved to the small kitchen nook, grabbing a simple cup of water and offering it to her. She accepted it silently, her hands trembling slightly as she took it. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. But there was a chill that lingered between us, an unspoken understanding that we were both on the edge of something, on the cusp of a journey we couldn't fully comprehend. She drank slowly, taking her time, as though every sip was a fragile attempt to piece herself back together. "I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden," she murmured after a long pause, her voice low. "The people who destroyed my world, they might be looking for me. They're relentless. They never stop." Her words were laced with fear, but there was also a kind of resignation in her tone, as if she had come to accept that survival wasn't something guaranteed. Her gaze met mine again, and I saw the raw, unguarded emotion in her eyes, the hopelessness of being lost, the terror of not knowing if she could trust anyone, or if there was anyone left to trust. It was overwhelming, and yet, I couldn't just let her fade into nothing. "You're safe here," I said firmly, though I wasn't entirely sure if I believed the words myself. The truth was, I didn't know if she was safe. I didn't know if there was anyone looking for her, if there was anyone who could help. But in that moment, with her sitting in my cabin, looking so fragile and lost, I knew that I would do everything in my power to protect her. She didn't respond right away, but after a moment, she gave a slight nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I sat down across from her, the silence between us thick with unspoken thoughts. As the storm raged outside, I found myself staring into the fire, the flickering flames casting strange shadows on the walls, as though they were trying to hide the truth from us. And perhaps they were. Perhaps the truth was too vast, too overwhelming for either of us to fully grasp in that moment. But one thing was clear: it was no longer alone in my quiet mountain retreat. The presence of this mysterious, alien woman had altered everything. Chapter 3: The Weight of the Unknown. Days passed since the storm had brought her into my life, and each one seemed to blend into the next, as if time itself had lost its meaning. The quiet rhythms of my isolated existence had been shattered, replaced by the weight of responsibility. The woman whose name, I had learned, was Lyra had settled into my cabin, though she remained distant, like a shadow that couldn't quite step fully into the light. She never spoke much of her past, and when I asked her questions, her answers were vague, veiled in the same sadness that had filled her eyes the moment we met. It was clear that whatever she had fled from, it had left scars that she wasn't ready to face. The days we spent together were a mixture of uncertainty and fragile moments of connection. Lyra had begun to trust me, if only slightly, but it was a slow process. She would help with simple tasks around the cabin: cooking, cleaning, gathering firewood, but it was always in silence. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as though she was constantly assessing the safety of her surroundings. She didn't ask much from me, but I could see the occasional glance of gratitude in her eyes whenever I did something for her: when I provided her with a meal, when I gave her a blanket on the colder nights, when I simply sat with her in the silence, letting her know she wasn't alone. But no matter how many days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had only been the beginning. There were things she hadn't told me, secrets buried deep within her past that she wasn't ready to share. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the situation we were in. Lyra had come from the stars, she had told me as much, but there were so many questions that hung in the air unanswered. How had she arrived here? Why had she been alone? What was it that had destroyed her world? And what danger did that leave for us here, now? One evening, after several quiet days had passed, I decided it was time to ask again, to dig a little deeper, to try and understand what was really happening. The fire crackled low in the hearth as I sat down beside her, my voice calm but insistent. "Lyra," I began, the weight of my question already hanging between us. "Tell me about your world. I need to understand what happened. Please." She looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away again. But instead, her eyes softened. There was a sadness in her gaze, but also a weariness, as though she had been carrying this burden for far too long. Her lips parted as if to speak, and for the first time in days, she seemed to truly consider my words. "I wasn't always alone," she began slowly, her voice a whisper of a memory. "There were others, people like me. We lived in peace for centuries, in harmony with the world and the stars. But then, they came." Her eyes glazed over, and I could see her struggling to hold back tears. "They came from another galaxy, seeking to conquer, to destroy. They didn't care who we were, what we believed in. They came for power, for control." She paused, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for the cup beside her. "And in the end, they wiped us out. My world, my people." She choked on the words, and I could see the pain in her expression. "They didn't leave anyone alive. I was the only one who made it out. And now, I don't know where to go. I don't know if there's anyone left." Her voice broke, and I could see the agony in her face, the raw emotion that she had kept bottled up for so long. It was then that I realized the magnitude of what she had survived. Lyra wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she had witnessed the end of everything she had ever known. Her world, Her people, everything was gone, and she was left to wander the void, lost and alone. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could ease her pain. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out, slowly, cautiously, and placed a hand on hers, offering what little comfort I could. It wasn't much, but it was all I had to give. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, I would stand by her. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever forces were still searching for her, I would protect her. We had both found something in each other, a bond forged in the fire of shared struggle, and in that bond, we would face whatever came next together. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and for a long while, we sat in silence. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the room as Lyra's breathing gradually returned to normal. Her hand remained under mine, trembling slightly at first, but as the minutes passed, I felt the tremor fade, replaced by something else, a quiet strength, the kind of resilience that comes from having survived the unimaginable. She had lost everything: her people, her world, her home, and yet, she was still here, still fighting, still trying to hold on. I had no answers for her. I had no way of returning her home, no way to undo the devastation that had torn her world apart. But in that moment, I realized something important. I didn't need to fix everything for her. What she needed wasn't someone who had all the answers, it was someone who would stand by her, someone who would help her carry the weight of the unknown. I couldn't undo her past, but I could offer her a future, at least for as long as I was able to. "I'm sorry," she whispered after a long silence. Her voice was raw, as if the floodgates had opened, and she couldn't stop the torrent of grief that had been building inside her for so long. "I didn't mean to bring this into your life. You didn't sign up for this." Her words were soft, apologetic, and yet I could hear the pain in them, the guilt of dragging someone else into her nightmare. I shook my head firmly, my voice quiet but resolute. "You didn't bring this into my life. It's fate, I guess. Whatever it is, we're in this together now. You're not alone, Lyra. You're not alone anymore." She didn't answer right away, but I could see the slight relief in her expression as the weight of her isolation lifted, if only for a moment. Her eyes softened, and she allowed herself to rest, to let go of the tight grip she had on her emotions. I knew it wasn't a permanent solution, but for tonight, for this one moment, it was enough. We sat there, side by side, letting the fire's warmth and the quiet of the cabin be our only company. The night stretched on, the storm eventually abating outside, leaving only the sound of the occasional crackling wood in the fireplace. Lyra had fallen asleep by the fire, her exhaustion evident, but I remained awake, watching over her. As I sat in the stillness, my thoughts wandered, wondering about the vastness of the universe and how a single, seemingly random encounter could turn the course of someone's life. I had never imagined I'd be part of something so extraordinary, yet here I was, sitting beside an alien woman who had come from the stars, carrying the weight of the cosmos in her heart. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me as well, and I allowed my own eyes to close, my mind drifting into a restless sleep. But even as I slept, I knew that tomorrow would bring more questions, more challenges, and more unknowns. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind. The unknown wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace, because we were facing it together. Chapter 4: A New Dawn. Morning arrived quietly, with the first light of dawn filtering through the small cabin's windows. The storm had passed, and the world outside was calm, peaceful, even. I could hear the birds beginning to sing, the soft rustle of the trees as the wind started to stir again. But it was a gentle breeze this time, a reminder that life continued even after the chaos had passed. I rose from my chair, stretching my limbs as the remnants of sleep faded from my mind. Lyra was still asleep, her body curled up near the fire, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets I had draped over her the night before. She looked peaceful in that moment, her features softened by rest, but I knew the storm inside her had not completely passed. As I moved about the cabin, preparing breakfast, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought us to this point. When I had first stumbled across her in the woods, I had no idea what to expect. But now, as I prepared to face whatever lay ahead, I knew that she wasn't just a stranger I had found in the storm. She had become a part of my life, my responsibility, and I would do whatever it took to help her heal, to help her find peace, and to help her rebuild whatever could be rebuilt. Lyra stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she sat up slowly, the faintest hint of confusion in her gaze as she took in her surroundings. It wasn't the first time she had woken in this cabin, but it was the first time she didn't seem as wary, as though the fear that had gripped her for so long was finally starting to loosen its hold. She looked at me, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something I hadn't seen before: hope. "Good morning," I said, my voice soft but warm, not wanting to startle her. I set a steaming bowl of food down in front of her, along with a fresh cup of water. She blinked, clearly still adjusting to the world around her. "Good morning," she replied, her voice quiet but more grounded than it had been the night before. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of the food fill the air. "Thank you," she added, her voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward finding something resembling normalcy in the chaos of her life. I nodded, offering a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. You're safe here." For the first time in a long time, Lyra smiled back. It wasn't the forced, broken smile of someone who had been worn down by the world. No, this smile was different. It was hesitant, but it was real. It was the smile of someone who had found a small flicker of warmth in the cold, a small reason to believe that things could be better. As we ate, the conversation turned to the future. Lyra spoke more freely now, her words coming easier as she began to process everything that had happened to her. She didn't have all the answers, and neither did I, but together, we talked about possibilities. She spoke of a distant hope, a dream of returning home, or at least finding some trace of her people, some way to rebuild what had been lost. I didn't know how we would achieve that, but I promised her that I would help in whatever way I could. The days that followed were filled with small steps, learning about each other, building trust, and preparing for the unknowns that awaited us. We worked together to make the cabin a better place, and in doing so, we built something more than just shelter. We built a bond. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And as the weeks turned into months, I realized something I hadn't expected. In helping her heal, in offering her a place to stay, I had found something for myself. Purpose. Connection. I had thought I was alone in the world, but now, I knew that I wasn't. Together, Lyra and I were writing our own story, one page at a time. One evening, as we stood outside the cabin, watching the stars twinkle above us, Lyra turned to me. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. "I thought I was alone, lost in a universe that didn't care. But you found me." I looked at her, smiling. "And I'll never let you go." For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. With Lyra by my side, we were no longer lost. We were together, and that was enough. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape. And as the stars shimmered above, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together.